Obvious first question. Can you hear me? Yes? Well, there's a certain symmetry to my introducing Morris to have the last word. It's exactly 60 years ago, maybe to the day even, that we met. And we met right here, for all I know, in this exact spot, certainly not very far from it. It was the old Building 20 at that time. I was at Harvard. Carol, my wife, was working here in Morris's lab, the same lab that Morris was on speech analysis, and I stopped by to pick her up after work. The two of us had just come to Boston a couple of months earlier. Neither of us had ever been away from home before. It was kind of like going from the farm to Paris. And that time, Cambridge was the peak of scientific and the cultural achievement in the world in his early post-war years. Carol needed a job. She had a recommendation from a professor at Penn to William Locke, who was the head of the Modern Languages Department here. We went over to Building 14, where the Modern Language Department was. This was her first ever job application. She's a 20-year-old kid just out of college. So she was kind of intimidated. I sat down on the first floor of Building 14. She went up. About 45 minutes later, she came down kind of shaken. I asked her what happened, and she said, well, she went into Professor Locke's office, and he sent her down to the hall to talk to someone in another office, and the person in the office was a very stern, middle-aged man who turned out was 25, you know, who asked her very hard questions, and she didn't think she would ever get the job, but she got the job. And and then goes on from there. When I talked a couple of days ago, I mentioned something that I think is significant enough so that I'll say it again. A very dramatic fact about the last 50 years of the department, is that the questions that you people are discussing today would have been unformulable, in fact unimaginable, back in the 1950s. Whereas in contrast, the questions that were being discussed in the 1950s would have been easily intelligible long before, in fact millennia before. And that's quite a significant point of inflection. And in fact, you people are the ones who are responsible for it, should be gratified by that. And it's immensely gratifying to be able to see the outcome, and no less so to be able to introduce the stern, middle-aged man who deserves the credit for this, so Morris.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you. These remarks, what I wrote was, these are remarks about how things happened here by someone to whom they happened. And now I am probably the oldest here, and the one, by some miracle, I'm still here and upright, as you can see. That's the one that fact is sort of pretty amazing to me. But, you know, when you get to be 88, which sounds totally absurd to me, the statement somehow sounds false. Morris is 88 is a statement that sounds to me somehow wrong, but it's true, unfortunately. Okay. The origins of the linguistic program at MIT go back to World War II and to its profound effects on the way research was conducted in universities, first in the US and soon elsewhere as well. Now, before World War II, research in universities was sort of retail and small-scale affair. Now, what happened during World War II was there were two very huge research projects. One was the atomic bomb project at Los Alamos, and the other one was the radar project at MIT. It was called RadLab. And these were, they hired university people worked in them, and the money that was being spent was just completely unbelievable. I mean, nobody had ever thought of anything. Here, I just made this, I guess here. You see this slide. Now, if you, that's $0 in 1940. And it was $1 billion in 1900, just before 1970. And then it sort of leveled off a little bit below $1 billion and went, I mean, you see that very steep slope starting at 1950 and going to 1970. I mean, and that was, I came to MIT at the bottom of that slope, and and then it sort of leveled off. But most of my career, the actual part of my career was on the rise of that enormous rise, and you don't, when you are first an assistant professor or some kind of person around here, of course you don't know what goes on. But the fact of the matter was that there was always money available. And there was always, if you had it wasn't a question of trying to find money, it was a question of thinking of ways of spending it. And I mean, it was, I cannot convey to any of you what it was like. Now, I mean, Norm and I, we shared most of it, and I started at the very bottom, and it was really remarkable. Now, that is the background. The radar project, the project that came here was RadLab, and that was a radar project. It had that was a British invention that was being developed in Britain, but they had, because there was fears that Britain might be invaded by Germany and this might fall into German hands, RadLab was moved to MIT. And in 43, they erected on this site a temporary building that many of you know, Building 20. And what was great about Building 20 was that by about 1960, other buildings were being built around in MIT, so that Building 20 was not very desirable. And but there's always space there, and we always had the feeling that more space, quality didn't really matter. It's quantity that played a role. And so we always had a lot of, now it was very surprising to many people who came here that students got offices and that they were expected to spend time in, it wasn't expected, maybe that's too strong a word, but it was indicated that, you know, if you want to learn something, you better hang around the office and you might learn something which nobody's going to teach you in your class. And a lot of the teaching went on, and that I think is a real innovation in teaching method was that it was among as conversation between people who are interested in the problems. And I believe it still continues, I hope it does, because it was a very effective way of learning, because and that could not be planned. It was impossible. It's impossible to plan this. It just has to happen. And Building 20 was a place where it could happen. Okay, now, if those of you who haven't seen Building 20, there's some pictures of Building 20 by the elevator in this building. If you go in the elevator in the D wing of this building, there's some photographs, and you can look at them. Okay. I'll begin by reading a passage about the development of this these early days from Jay Kaiser's book, Mens et Mania, the MIT Nobody Knows. MIT is, he wrote, MIT is the love child of the War Department, euphemistically remained the Department of Defense in 1949. As a result of World War II, and later of the Korean War, the Defense Department pumped over $1 billion, by today's reckoning, into the Institute during the 40s and 50s, and that's the picture. And that's immense. I mean, I cannot emphasize how important that was. The changes in the side of the Institute faculty show the impact of all that money. By the end of World War II, MIT had somewhat over 250 faculty members. That was the whole faculty. A quarter of a century later, that number had quadrupled. And it has been at that level ever since. There are about 1,000 MIT faculty members now. And it has not really changed very much. The number of undergraduates also followed this very pattern. Less than 10,000 in 1945, 4,000 in 1975, 4,232 in 2009. So it's really leveled off. The Institute's operating budget increased by a third when the Korean War started in 1950, and by more than a third again the next year. The place was blowing up like a balloon. And even when the Korean War ended, government money continued pouring in. Sponsored research funds doubled every 6 years until 1968. And that's this picture that I think is so dramatic. In 1951, when I was first appointed to the MIT faculty as an assistant professor in the Department of Modern Languages, the department offered a few linguistics courses already. They were then taught by a Swiss linguist by the name of Bodmer, who was an author of a then popular book with an alliterating title called The Loom of Language. Some of you might have read it. Bodmer's book was part of a British series of popular books of science, all of which had alliterating titles. So some other titles that I remember was Science for the Citizen, Mathematics for the Millions, and there were others, but I don't remember them. Maybe some of you. Okay, so that was. Now, soon in 1951. It was in 1951 that Noam and Carol came to MIT, and Noam was a junior fellow at Harvard. And as Noam said, it was around 51 that we first met. Now, in the spring of 1955, I remember meeting Noam, I don't know, either accidentally or somehow. He told me that his term as junior fellow was coming to an end. It had already been extended for an extra year. And he said, "Do you know of a job for me?" Natural question. And I said, "Well, I'll ask. fortunately, what happened was that Bodmer, who was teaching the linguistics courses at MIT at that moment, was about to retire. And he was, and there would be, and in the next fall, in the fall of 1955, there was an opening. And so I suggested that Noam go and talk to our department head, and he managed to convince the department head that that he was a worthy candidate, and he's since been at MIT. Now, in taking over Bodmer's courses, Noam not only changed their content, he also changed, in a very fundamental way, everything that we know about, that we think about when we think about language. I mean, it was just the first series of courses that he taught here. They formed the content, much of the content of Noam's syntactic structures, and they sort of really laid the foundations to the way we think about. Everybody here thinks about language, and it's very different from the way people thought about what language was all about and what linguistics should be like. One way that, as explained in syntactic structures, is that language has sort of three parts. Now, the utterances of every language have two distinct representations. One of these two representations is defined by rules, and now I quote, from which their phrase structure can be reconstructed. The utterances can be assigned phrase structure. The other set of rules defined those were the morphophonemic rules. They converted strings of abstract morphemes into strings of phonemes or sounds. And now connecting these two representations was a set of transformational rules that carried strings with phrase structures into new strings to which the morphophonemic rules could then apply. Now, this is, in various ways, this is sort of the way that people think about even now, not in detail, and obviously the terminology is so old-fashioned and it would be very different, but there's a real change in the understanding of what linguistics is all about. And this was first carried out by Noam, first presented by Noam in this early course. Another thing that linguistic theory did very differently then. It was thought that linguistic theory, that theories of language or grammars should be in the form of discovery procedures. They should provide means for going from the raw data, from a transcription of utterances in terms of phonemes, into some kind of abstract structure. Now, one of the very early things that Noam did was to argue against the possibility of carrying out successfully that project. And so discovery procedures, grammars in the form of discovery procedures where let's say the phonemic representation is derived in a very strict sense from the phones of the utterance. After publication of syntactic structures, that completely disappeared, and nobody's even, I believe, even talks about it. Now, this brings my story to the year 1960-61, which is the year of the launching of the MIT PhD program. In fact, during that, the preceding year, during the year the MIT program started in the fall of '61. And I'm happy to see all the surviving members of the class are here. Barbara Partee, I don't see you, but there you are. Well, let me see. I have it written down here. Oh my God. Oh yeah. Terry Langdon. He is not here, but Bruce Fraser, you were here. I saw you before. No. No. He was here earlier. Tom Bever, I saw him a few minutes ago. Yeah, here he is. Then there was Terry Langdon, who hasn't come. He's at the University of Arizona. Unfortunately, two are no longer with us. James McCauley, who was professor at the University of Chicago, and Ted Leitner, who was I don't remember where he was at the end. Illinois, yes, at Illinois. And they have, unfortunately, they no longer with us. Now, how we got such a remarkable class is utter miracle. You know, I mean, we didn't. I think Tom Bever I recruited. I knew I met Tom and we used to argue, and so I said, well, why don't you want to be a student here? And he was you were going to be a psychologist, right? And so I sidetracked him for a little while, but then he went back to psychology. Barbara Partee, I think she knew somebody who knew Noam in Philadelphia or something like that. Isn't that right? Yeah, I mean, it was all by word of mouth. And it was a remarkable class to have. And somehow that has remained. The quality of students has uniformly been high in all the years that I was here, and I presume it still is when I'm no longer here. And that was really somehow a matter of luck, because we didn't have. As I said, we just recruited people that we knew, but then people started. The department got some reputation, and we did rather well. Now, our efforts were very often rewarded. The first time our efforts were rewarded was when it was a few years after we started the linguistics program. There appeared in the New York Times a report on a poll that was being conducted about the quality of graduate departments in different fields. And, you know, MIT was first in chemistry or second in chemistry, and they were first in mechanical engineering and so on. And all these that you would expect, MIT ranked very, very high. But then there was, totally to the surprise of everybody, the MIT Linguistics program, it wasn't even a department, was number one. And we shared first place with Cornell. And that was totally amazing. And when the president of MIT, Howard Johnson, is reported to have said, "I did not know that we had linguistics." You know, we weren't very. That was supposed to have been his reaction. So. That was just pure luck. I still don't know why we got such a high rating, because people didn't think of us so highly. At least they didn't write about our work in such laudatory terms. Now, in the 1960s, Noam and I were collaborating on a study of the sound structure of English and of languages in general. And this collaboration ultimately became our book, The Sound Pattern of English. at the beginning of our conversation, collaboration, we had somewhat divergent views on the nature of phonology, but we succeeded in achieving consensus on most of them by the end. Now, for example, Noam had written a book that was completed in 1951 called The Morphophonemics of Modern Hebrew. Before he'd come to MIT, and he gave me this book, and I read it for about I don't know how many years. I kept looking at it and reading it, and then I finally understood it. And what it was all about was that there were ordered. The whole idea was that there were that I found very difficult to understand was that rules were ordered, and that the ordering really mattered very much, and that it was not just a historical fact that you know. Let's say that English, the vowel shift, and the Grimm's law was a rule that you could see still in English, but I mean that this was really part of an actual grammar, and that was very hard for me to understand. And what particularly was difficult was to understand that these rules could survive. As they seem to be, I mean, so for example, we discovered, let's say, that the English vowel shift, the rules of the English vowel shift, had to be part of the synchronic grammar of English, but then we found out that these rules were introduced. I mean, we knew that these rules were first introduced into the language around Chaucer's time, after Chaucer. Now, how could it be that something that was introduced into the language in 1300 or 1400 was still, in the year 1950, was still, I mean, it took us a very long time to grasp it. And what really did it for me was that when we discovered these two also were the simplest. I mean, they were formerly the simplest accounts with the help of these rules. And then, all of a sudden, it simply didn't matter. I mean, how old a rule has no effect on anything. We were just wrong. We just lacked imagination if we didn't think rules could survive for generations. What mattered was their content, and their content was whatever it was, and it stayed in the language or it didn't stay in the language, and that explained why you pronounce certain words in English, why you say divine but divinity, and profane but profanity. I mean, these alternations were explained by these rules, and these rules well, they were introduced in the 14th century or 13th century or whenever, and they still continue to operate to this day. Now, okay, in 1968, yes, I since that time I've had quite a bit of occasion to study the history of Slavic languages. And again, in those studies, I found very many historical parallels. And so really the discovery was that there are rules, and that the rules stay in the language. It's not the rules of the language that you speak are also used by your parents and your grandparents and so on, and it's not they could go back for many, many centuries. And that was sort of at least emotionally difficult thing to believe. And ultimately we did, and phonology, I think, has improved because of that. Now, I've said before that good luck played a very big role in what went on here. And one of the great bits of good luck that I thought was that in the 1960s, I don't really remember anymore. I think I went to an LSA meeting and I met Ken Hale. And I came back and I said to Noam, we got to hire him. And Noam said, yes. And after some negotiation, we did actually hire. And now, those of you who didn't know Ken Hale, it's a great. Ken Hale died about 10 years ago. He was not only was he a very excellent theoretical linguist, but he had the ability to learn a language after very short, a few weeks or months of exposure to the language. So I think in the 80s he went to Holland, and then he decided that he would lecture in Dutch. Now, they told him it was totally unnecessary. They could all speak English. Everybody there spoke English fluently. But he wanted to lecture in Dutch. And, and the report was that he lectured flawlessly after about, a month or two having been there. Now, to have known such a person and to have, had him down the hall and you drop in and you say, well, what do you think about this, and so on. It's a very different world when you have that kind of person. And I personally was very, very fortunate in that I had both him and Noam down the hall, and there were other people, Michael Kenstowitz, who came later, and various other, Don Casteriado, and we had a very nice department that I'm very grateful to have had them for colleagues, and I want to thank them now. We in the 1970s, there was some discussion at MIT about the organization, the bureaucratic organization of the School of Humanities. And the School of Humanities in those days had a department of philosophy, but linguistics was not a department. We were just a program in the Department of Modern Languages. And when MIT talked about reorganizing the School of Humanities, one of the bureaucratic structural flaws was that there was this very small department of philosophy, and the philosophers got real worried about it. And at some point, now I was friends at that time. In fact, we lived both in Newton at that time with Sylvan Bromberger and I. We've been friends. Our friendship was based on the fact that 20 years before, in the early 40s, we had gone to high school in George Washington High School, and we knew each other vaguely. I mean, when we saw each other, we remembered that, yes, you'd gone to George Washington, and we both remembered we'd gone to a class of English for foreigners that we had to attend. And so we were quite friendly, and when this problem arose about restructuring of the humanities, Sylvan and I discussed it, and in particular, we took on a cold day. I mean, I remember it was sort of in the fall of 1974, 75. It was a very cold day. We walked along the river, around the river basin, and then we crossed into Boston on the Longfellow Bridge, and came back on the Massachusetts Avenue Bridge. And at the end, we decided that it didn't make sense for us to be a section in modern languages and them to, and philosophy to be a small department. That it would be best if the linguistics section merged into the Department of Philosophy, that then would be bureaucratically a more, I don't know, bigger entity, and that so after a little while of talking, I went, we consulted our departmental colleagues, and then I went to the dean, and I sort of expected that he would put up various obstacles, and I had all kinds of arguments prepared to deal with what I imagined he might say. Instead, I was sort of like the guy pushing against an open door. He said, "Well, yeah. When do you want to merge?" I mean, I mean, so it was just we just moved the section from I mean, we moved into the Department of Philosophy that then was renamed Department of Linguistics and Philosophy, and ever since we've been a single department. Now, we also had a problem at the time in that neither Noam nor anybody I knew who I thought was of the right-minded person wanted to be department head. And so there was a problem about who was going to be the department head of that new department. And I had been friends with Jay Kaiser, who was then at the University of Massachusetts. And I said, well, we ought to hire Jay as department head. And since everything else went smoothly, that also went smoothly. And Jay became the department head of the first of the... now, as the department has developed, we have not, unfortunately, really merged. I mean, the philosophy operates and linguistics, they operate really, they happen to be in the same department. And the only time they cooperate is when they choose department heads. And that is always alternating. You know, different people here. There's a philosopher, and then he or she is followed by a linguist, and in turn. So there's always alternation. But otherwise, and if I can express a wish, and this is the end of my speech, is that I'd hope very much that, you know, when there's another occasion, let's say 25 years from now, at which time I doubt that I'll be present, that if I can express the wish that the two parts will be more together than they have been in the past. Thank you. Want to leave, okay.
Questions for you. Now is the moment they should have questions for
yeah, if you have either questions for me or comments that you'd like to... we'll stay around until...
Haj Ross has a question.
Oh, Haj Ross? Well, where is he?
He's right there.
Haji?
Thanks. It was great to hear that viewpoint, Morris, and it takes all of us...
He's in the dark.
Okay. There.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, here I am. I liked what you said very much about how Noam's teaching, when he first started, was radically different, and I agree entirely with what you said about rules that generated things and so on, but there's another thing which I always remember from reading syntactic structures, and I bet lots of people remember it too, said by taking a precisely formulated but inadequate model and
Excellent.
pushing it to an unacceptable result, one can make progress. So,
Excellent.
and if you look before at, for instance, grammarians of English or French or whatever, they would say things like, we rarely find this in the negative. But it was completely different with Noam's program. What we did is shoot for the stars, is what I said. We were very happy if we could make a precise rule which would generate a bad sentence, right? And that's, it sounds like a very tiny difference, but it's a huge one. And I would like to just take this opportunity to thank you for everything, but in particular for your incredible wit. I want to tell you a story which we didn't tell last night. It was in my first class, which I took as a special student in your class in phonology. And Tony Nero was in the class, and he said, you had given us a problem or something, and he said, here's the way to solve this problem. And you said, no, you can't do that. That's theoretically impossible. That the grammar won't allow that. And Nero said, but Chomsky did it yesterday in the lecture. So how can you reply in Latin? Quod licet Jovi, non licet bovi. What is allowed to Jove is not allowed to cows.
Nobody wants to say anything? Oh. Yeah, you need that.
I want to comment on your last remark about the fact that the philosophers and the linguists haven't done very much together. You and I have done a lot together. We're the only people, I think, who've managed by working together to work on the philosophy of phonology of all things and the foundations of phonology. And I think the field of philosophy has been very much enriched as a result of your contribution to it.
Yeah, but you know, I think of you as my friend. I don't really think of you as a professional in that sense. I would work with you anytime. You wouldn't have to be an MIT professional. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot. Tom.
So, you spoke about the happenstance of the first few classes. It really, given the behavior of my relatives, when I told them that I was going to MIT to study linguistics, I would say that the early classes basically had to self-select as renegades. A particular family member known to you, among others, also to Noam, looked at me and he said, what? You're going to study that discipline? And he came around fairly quickly, but the point was that there was no reputation, there was nothing to go on except, as I said last night, Noam was the smartest thing since sliced bread that I'd come across, and you convinced me in 2 seconds that I was wrong about something that I had been thinking about for a long time. And I figured, these are the guys I want to be around. I don't care what they're studying. And I think that to some extent, if I look at the fellow class members from the first class, they all had a very independent, they had to, we had to, because it was not business as usual. Nobody knew whether a PhD in this particular discipline was going to turn into a profession. And so it had to be people who were very independent-minded and a little crazy.
Just say something that actually Noam told me, talking about we don't know whether there's going to be a profession waiting for us when we finish. a story I've known for many years, but I heard this story for the first time last spring. He told me that when he and Carol got married, their parents were very nervous that, how they were going to support themselves. And Norm reported that his mother had gone for a walk around Philadelphia and came back completely disappointed and discouraged because she was looking for signs that said linguist wanted and didn't find any. Actually, he told me the story when I was complaining about my son and that he doesn't do what he's supposed to do, and this was a consolation story.
I'm going to tell a love story. I was accepted at MIT in 1998. I don't know why, because I was a kind of person who, I think, read science fiction books and painted her fingernails during linguistics classes. And people sort of tell me about that, and I blush. I was supposed to be a syntactician. At that point, I was doing a lot of creative writing, not very much syntax. So I came to MIT, and I decided, well, I'll be doing syntax. I had to take some phonology classes, and I had to take some semantics classes, and I thought, well, I'll be doing syntax. Well, now, I'm presumably more of a semanticist than a syntactician, or maybe interface, no matter. At some point, I had to write my generals paper in phonology, and I didn't know what to do. So I came to Morris, and I said, Morris, I don't like phonology. I have this thing that I've been thinking of about Russian. Can you help me? And Morris did. And sometimes now I do phonology just for fun. And you know that the result is not what it should be, but still, it's for fun. So I just wanted to say to Morris, I love you. And I wanted to say to the entire linguistics department, thank you very much for turning me from a scatterbrain into a syntax semantics interface person who does phonology for fun.
It's on? Is it? Okay. Morris once told me that the definition of a genius was someone who knew the right answer without having to do the work. And I think by that definition, Morris certainly qualifies. And the reason why I say that is that when I first came here, I've been working on a problem in Middle English. The problem was really how did the stress system change from Old English to the one we have today. And I'd been working on it for a year, and then finally I remember going to see Morris and telling him what I'd done. And Morris looked at me and he said, "You'll find the answer in Old French." And I said, "Well, how do you know that?" He said, "Just go look." And he was absolutely right. And as a result of that conversation, we wrote this book, English Stress, its form, its growth, and its role in verse. But I was just astonished. He knew exactly where to look and told me.
I'd like to make a couple remarks about sound pattern. Well, 3 remarks about sound pattern. I taught a course to the grad students at UCLA on English phonology just this last academic quarter, so I had occasion to look at stuff like trisyllabic shortening and all the great stuff in sound pattern. So my 3 remarks are this. First, it is the hardest book I ever read. And I was kind of relieved that whatever it is, 30-some years later, it was a little bit easier, because now I'm a phonologist, but it's just stunning. Maybe the hardest book someone else has read, I don't know. The second is that it is one of the most unusual physical objects that I own. If you have the MIT Press edition, you'll miss out on this, but Harper and Row printed it in this amazing hardcover with embossed abstract feature matrices on the cover. And I swear to God, it looks sort of like a heathen temple. Just this object of wonder and mystery. And lastly, I would like to point out an error in sound pattern. You were a little bit timid about velar softening. That is, you said that in order for a K or a G to undergo velar softening, it must bear a special diacritic, sub D, in the lexicon. A lexical search for the sequences of velar stops followed by the relevant front vowels like ki, gi, kai, gai indicates that they are strongly underrepresented in the English vocabulary, and thus it would be far more sensible to mark these as exceptions to velar softening rather than to mark the undergoers. I say this because just in case you want to get started on the second edition, I'd be happy to share my notes.
Thank you very much. And thank you very, very much. And I hope you all enjoyed this meeting as much as I did. Thank you for coming. Bye-bye.